In the tactical lexicon of the Vietnam War, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SAS, operated on a philosophy of isolation. They were the phantoms of the jungle, designed to see without being seen, to collect intelligence, and to vanish before the enemy knew they were there. A standard patrol consisted of just 5 men, a commander, a scout, a signaller, and 2 riflemen. Against the vast, green backdrop of Phuoc Tuy province, they were a microscopic entity. Usually, this small footprint was their greatest armor, but the jungle is a chaotic environment, and even the most disciplined ghosts can be exercised by bad luck. When stealth failed, the mathematics of survival shifted instantly from skill to pure, terrifying probability. The nightmare scenario began with a bump. Perhaps a twig snapped at the wrong moment, or a sudden shift in the wind carried the scent of western sweat to an enemy sentry dog. In a heartbeat, the silence of the triple canopy rainforest would be shattered by the cracking staccato of AK-47 fire. For the 5 men of the SAS patrol, the immediate priority was the immediate action, IA drill, break contact. The doctrine was to unleash a furious wall of automatic fire to stun the enemy, peel back, and fade into the undergrowth. But the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Main Force Viet Cong were not amateurs. They were hardened veterans who understood the tactics of their enemy. They knew that if they encountered a small team, they had to close the distance immediately to negate the Australians' escape routes. The situation described in this narrative arises when the break contact drill fails. The patrol finds themselves not just engaged, but pinned. The enemy is not a ragged squad of guerrillas, but a full reinforced company, perhaps 80 to 100 men maneuvering in a pincer movement. The air fills with green tracers. The foliage around the Australians is shredded by RPD machine gun fire. The 5 men are forced flat against the earth, the mud their only cover. This is the mathematics of death, 5 rifles against 100. If the Australians try to stand up and run, they will be cut down. If they stay where they are, the enemy will flank them, surround them, and overrun their position within minutes. The NVA tactic of hugging the belt, moving so close to the enemy that air support cannot be used, is in full effect. In this claustrophobic hell, the SAS patrol has only one lifeline remaining. It is not their modified SLR rifles, nor their grenades. It is the AN PRC-25 radio strapped to the back of the signaller. Through the static and the roar of gunfire, the signaller must reach out to the only force capable of equalizing these impossible odds, the artillery batteries back at the fire support base. And in Phuoc Tuy, that call often went to a specific group of men who shared a bond of blood and history with the Australians, the 161 Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, the Kiwis. The patrol leader looks at his map, then at the enemy closing in from 30 meters away. He knows that to survive, he has to do the unthinkable. He has to call down the thunder of the gods, not on the enemy, but on himself. In the sterile environment of a military classroom, the term danger close is a procedural warning. According to the artillery manuals of the era, it technically applied to any fire mission where the intended target lay within 600 meters of friendly troops. At this distance, the forward observer, FO, was required to follow strict protocols, double-checking coordinates, and ensuring the gun line made no calculation errors. 600 meters was the safety buffer, a comfortable margin for error. But deep in the humid claustrophobia of the Vietnamese jungle, the textbook definition of danger close was a dark joke. For the SAS patrol pinned down by a company of NVA regulars, 600 meters might as well have been a different continent. The war they were fighting was intimate and visceral. The enemy wasn't a blip on a radar screen. They were men shouting orders from behind a mahogany tree 20 paces away. They were close enough to be smelled, close enough to hear the metallic clack of a bolt cycling. In this context, the SAS redefined the term. When a patrol leader whispered danger close into his handset, he wasn't talking about hundreds of meters. He was talking about 50, sometimes 30. To understand the insanity of this request, one must understand the physics of the weapon being summoned. The standard support weapon for the Australian task force was the 105mm M2A2 howitzer. When a 105mm high-explosive HE shell detonates, It doesn't just make a loud noise. It disintegrates its steel casing into thousands of jagged, razor-sharp fragments traveling at supersonic speeds. The lethal geometry of this explosion is unforgiving. The kill radius, the zone where death is statistically guaranteed by blast overpressure or shrapnel, is approximately 30 to 35 meters. The casualty radius, the zone where a soldier is likely to be wounded or maimed by flying steel, extends out to 100 meters or more. The math, therefore, was terrifyingly simple. If the enemy was 30 meters away, and the patrol called in artillery on the enemy's position, the SAS team was effectively standing inside the blast radius of their own support fire. They were asking the battery to drop a bomb that was statistically just as likely to kill them as it was to kill the North Vietnamese. This was not a standard tactical maneuver. It was a suicide pact with a loophole. The loophole was verticality. An artillery shell detonating on impact sprays the majority of its shrapnel upwards and outwards in a V-shaped cone. The gamble relied on the fact that the SAS men would be lying prone, pressing their bodies into the mud, offering the smallest possible profile. The attacking enemy, by necessity, would be moving, crouching, or standing to fire. The SAS were betting their lives on the hope that the steel rain would fly inches above their backs and decapitate the enemy standing a foot higher. It was Russian roulette played with a howitzer. The margin for error had evaporated. A sudden gust of wind, a slight variation in the propellant temperature back at the gun pit, or a trembling hand on the elevation wheel could shift the impact point by 20 meters. That 20 meters was the difference between salvation and friendly fire. When the call went out, every man in the patrol knew that their survival was no longer in their own hands. It belonged to the physics of ballistics and the nerves of the men manning the guns miles away. In the center of the kill zone, the patrol's survival hinged on the voice of one man, the patrol signaller. While the other 4 members of the team poured suppression fire into the surrounding jungle, conserving their dwindling ammunition, the signaller lay prone, his face pressed into the dirt, clutching the handset of the AN, PRC-25. The discipline required in this moment was superhuman. Around him, the world was ending. The air was thick with the crack thump of supersonic bullets and the screams of combat. Yet, the signaller could not afford to panic. If he shouted, his voice would distort over the radio waves. If he rushed his coordinates, he would kill his friends. He had to speak with the monotone detachment of a drowsy telephone operator. Sunray. This is contact. Fire mission. Danger close. Over. The procedure rarely involved calling in a direct hit on the first salvo. Maps in Vietnam were notoriously unreliable, often based on old French surveys where a designated hill might actually be a valley. To call a grid coordinate and ask for fire for effect immediately was suicide. If the map was off by 100 meters, the first round could land directly in the patrol's lap. Instead, the SAS employed a terrifying technique known as walking the artillery. The patrol leader would estimate the enemy's position and call for a single spotting round a sighter to land a safe distance away, usually 200 to 300 meters beyond the contact. The patrol would wait, hearts hammering against their ribs, until they heard the distant crump of the shell. Then began the deadly game of inches. The patrol leader would gauge the sound and direction of the explosion relative to the enemy. Then, he would give the order that went against every survival instinct in the human brain. He would command the explosions to come closer. Drop 100, left 5-0. Bring it back 100 meters. Move it left 50. The next shell would scream in, detonating closer. The ground would shudder more violently. The shrapnel would tear through the canopy with a louder hiss. The enemy, realizing artillery was inbound, would often try to hug the SAS position even tighter, knowing that Western troops were reluctant to fire on themselves. The SAS countered this by tightening the noose. Drop 5-0, 50 meters closer. With each adjustment, the wall of noise and steel stepped toward the patrol. The shockwaves began to rattle their teeth. The smell of cordite and pulverized vegetation washed over them. It was a terrifying inverse tug-of-war. The patrol was literally pulling a curtain of destruction onto their own heads, daring the enemy to stay in the open. At this range, the margin for error was non-existent. The patrol leader had to visualize the battlefield in 3D, calculating the trajectory of the shells. He had to worry about tree bursts, shells hitting the high canopy and detonating in the air, which would rain shrapnel down vertically, negating the protection of lying prone. Finally, when the spotting rounds were landing just beyond the toes of the enemy and terrifyingly close to the faces of the Australians, the patrol leader would make the final, irrevocable call. He wasn't asking for one shell anymore. He was asking for the heavens to open. Target, grid correction perfect, battery fire, fire for effect. When the call for fire for effect crackled over the radio, the fate of the Australian patrol shifted from the jungle floor to a muddy gun pit miles away at Nui Dat. Here, stripped to the waist in the baking tropical heat, stood the men of the 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery. To the Americans, they were just another Allied unit. To the Australian SAS, they were the Kiwis, and they were the best gunners in Southeast Asia. The bond between the Australian SAS and the New Zealand Artillery was forged in the ANZAC tradition, a brotherhood dating back to the beaches of Gallipoli in World War I. In Vietnam, this relationship was more than historical sentiment, it was a tactical lifeline. The SAS operators knew that when they whispered into the handset, they weren't talking to a stranger. They were talking to men who drank the same beer, spoke the same slang, and shared the same disregard for rigid military bureaucracy in favor of getting the job done. Inside the gun pits, the atmosphere transformed instantly when the words "danger close" came down the line. The usual banter and rhythmic drills of a standard harassment fire mission evaporated. The gun crew's young men from Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch snapped into a state of hyper-focus. They knew exactly what was happening. They could hear the desperation in the signaler's voice, the background noise of the firefight bleeding through the transmission. They knew that 5 of their mates were lying face down in the dirt, praying for salvation. The responsibility was crushing. Operating the 105mm M2A2 howitzer at this level of precision was an exercise in perfectionism. At a range of 10,000 meters, an error in aim of just 1 mil, a standard artillery unit of angular measurement, would cause the shell to deviate by 10 meters. If the barrel was laid just 2 mils off to the left, or if the elevation was cranked a fraction of a degree too low, the shell wouldn't hit the Viet Cong. It would land directly on the SAS patrol. The number 1, the gun sergeant, would scream the coordinates. The layers would spin the heavy hand wheels, fighting the friction and the heat, aligning the sights with microscopic care. The loaders would check the fuses and the charge bags, ensuring the propellant temperature hadn't been spiked by the sun, which could cause the shell to fly further than calculated. Every variable had to be accounted for: wind speed, air density, even the rotation of the Earth. For the SAS patrol, this trust was absolute. They didn't just hope the Kiwis were good, they bet their lives on it. There is a terrifying intimacy in allowing someone to shoot a high-explosive projectile at you. It requires a belief that the man on the other end of the trajectory is as disciplined as you are. The Australians knew that the Kiwis took danger close personally. They knew the New Zealanders would rather blow up their own gun barrel than drop a round short. As the breech blocks slammed shut on the 105mm shells, the gun pits at Nui Dat became a place of silent prayer and violent action. The lanyard was pulled, the ground shook, and miles away, the Kiwi thunder began its arc toward the coordinates of the desperate 5 men. There is a deceptive pause after the radio confirms, "Shot, out." For a handful of seconds, the jungle returns to the immediate sounds of the firefight, the cracking of AKs and the shouts of the enemy closing in. The shells are airborne, traveling at supersonic speeds high above the canopy, silent and invisible. It is the longest silence in the world. Then, the sky tears open. It begins with a sound often described by veterans, not as a whistle, but as the ripping of a giant canvas sheet, a tearing, shrieking noise that vibrates in the teeth. Then comes the impact. When a battery of 6 guns fires for effect, the shells do not land as individuals. They land as a sledgehammer. The earth doesn't just shake, it turns liquid. For the SAS patrol lying prone, the sensation is akin to lying on a trampoline while someone jumps next to you. The shockwave travels through the soil, punching the air out of their lungs and slamming their bodies upward. The noise is beyond deafening. It is a physical pressure that pops eardrums and blurs vision. In the center of this apocalypse, The 5 Australians are doing the only thing that can save them, hugging the dirt. They press themselves into the mud with a desperation that defies anatomy, trying to become two-dimensional. They bury their faces in the rotting leaf litter, hands clasped over their heads, mouths open to equalize the pressure. Above them, the jungle is being erased. The 105mm shells, detonating just 30 to 50 meters away, are doing their work. The blast wave shears through the vegetation like a scythe. Ancient mahogany trees are snapped like matchsticks. Bamboo thickets are vaporized into green mist, but the true killer is the steel. Thousands of jagged fragments of hot metal scream through the air, joined by secondary shrapnel splinters of wood and rock that have been turned into lethal projectiles. This is where the cold calculus of the danger-close gamble pays off. The physics of an artillery burst creates a fragmentation cone, spraying the majority of the lethal steel upwards and outwards in a V-shape. Because the SAS men are flat against the ground, they are occupying the dead zone of the explosion, the tiny sliver of space beneath the primary arc of the shrapnel. The enemy, however, is not so lucky. The North Vietnamese soldiers, caught in the middle of their assault, are exposed. They are crouching, running, or standing to fire. In the geometry of artillery, they are vertical targets. The shrapnel that flies harmlessly over the backs of the Australians catches the enemy in the chest, head, and legs. The shock action is absolute. One moment, the NVA are an overwhelming force closing in for the kill. The next, they are engulfed in a curtain of fire and flying steel. The barrage is relentless. Shell after shell hammers the perimeter, churning the soil and creating a wall of impenetrable violence. The patrol is trapped inside a bubble of concussive force, their senses overloaded by the flash of detonations and the smell of ozone and cordite. They are alive only because they are low, and because the Kiwi gunners miles away are placing their rounds with the precision of surgeons. It is a terrifying paradox. The only thing keeping them from being overrun is the very bombardment that threatens to tear them apart. As the bombardment settled into a rhythm, the chaotic thunder transformed into a structured architectural design of destruction. This was not random fire. It was a calculated masterpiece of ballistics known as the box barrage. The signaller, voice raspy from smoke and shouting, coordinated with the battery to drop rounds on all 4 compass points surrounding the patrol. They were building a cage of fire. The Kiwi gunners adjusted their elevation and traverse with minute precision, walking the explosions around the perimeter of the SAS position. The effect was to create a hermetically sealed cordon of violence. To the north, south, east, and west, the jungle was being pulverized. The 105mm shells churned the earth, creating a continuous curtain of flying steel and blast pressure that severed the battlefield in two. For the North Vietnamese soldiers, this barrier was insurmountable. The momentum of their assault, which had been overwhelming just minutes prior, slammed into a physical wall. The NVA commanders, screaming orders to advance and overrun the small Australian team, found their men unable to move. To step into that ring of fire was suicide. The shrapnel density in the beaten zone was so high that it acted like a giant invisible shredder. Any soldier brave or foolish enough to try and charge through the barrage was instantly cut down before he could even see the Australians. The tactical situation had inverted. Minutes ago, the SAS were trapped. Now, they were encased in the most dangerous fortress on Earth. Inside this eye of the storm, the experience was surreal. The 5 Australians lay huddled in a tight defensive circle, heads touching, boots digging into the soil. While the world 10 meters away was being ripped apart, the center of the circle was terrifyingly, paradoxically safe. They were protected by the very thing that should have killed them. The noise was a solid object, a constant roar that rattled the bones and made teeth ache. The air pressure fluctuated wildly with every detonation, sucking the air out of their lungs and then slamming it back in. Dust, leaves, and pulverized wood rained down on them like a heavy monsoon storm, burying them in the debris of the jungle. Yet, through the terror, there was a grim sense of triumph. The enemy fire had slackened. The cracking of AK-47 seconds had been drowned out by the dominance of the artillery. The NVA, realizing they could not penetrate the steel shield, were forced to go to ground or pull back. The hugging the belt tactic, staying close to the enemy to avoid air power, had failed because the Australians had proven they were crazy enough to bomb themselves. The box barrage bought them the one thing they had run out of: time. It turned a fluid, losing battle into a static stalemate. As long as the Kiwis kept firing, and as long as the shells didn't drift those fatal few meters inwards, the SAS were untouchable. They were the masters of a tiny, decimated island of dirt, surrounded by a sea of fire. Then, as abruptly as it began, the thunder stopped. The radio crackled with the command "check fire, end of mission," and the gun pits at Nui Dat fell silent. In the jungle, the sudden absence of noise was almost more disorienting than the bombardment itself. The roar of the explosions was replaced by a high-pitched, screaming tinnitus that filled the men's heads. They lay there for a moment, stunned, buried under a layer of fresh earth, splintered wood, and shredded leaves. The air hung heavy, thick with the grey fog of pulverized soil and the acrid, metallic stench of cordite. It was a smell that every soldier knew, the smell of burnt explosive, but here, it was so concentrated it tasted like copper on the tongue. Slowly, the 5 ghosts began to stir. The patrol leader signaled for a status check. One by one, they sounded off or gave a thumbs up. They were battered, shaken, and deafened. Blood trickled from noses and ears, the result of the massive overpressure waves compressing their sinuses. Their uniforms were torn by flying debris, and they were coated in the grey dust of the craters. But miraculously, they were alive. The steel shield had held. Around them, the jungle had been transformed into a moonscape. The lush, triple-canopy rainforest was gone. In its place was a smoking clearing of jagged stumps and churned mud. The vegetation that had concealed the enemy was stripped away, leaving nowhere to hide. From the periphery of the cratered zone, the sounds of the enemy began to drift back in, not the aggressive war cries of the assault, but the groans of the wounded and the confused shouting of officers trying to rally shattered squads. The NVA had been mauled. The artillery had broken their spine, turning a disciplined attacking force into a chaotic rescue operation. This was the window of opportunity. The patrol leader knew it would only stay open for a few minutes before the enemy reorganized or brought up reserves. He grabbed the handset. Dust off, hot extraction required, immediate. Minutes later, a new sound cut through the ringing in their ears, the distinctive, rhythmic whop, whop, whop of rotor blades. The RAAF, no, 9 Squadron Albatross gunships or US Army slicks were inbound, skimming the treetops at breakneck speed. The patrol popped smoke, usually red or yellow, to mark their position. The vibrant coloured gas billowed up from the grey devastation, guiding the pilots in. The helicopters didn't land. They couldn't, amidst the craters and fallen timber. They hovered just feet above the ruin, their downdraft whipping the smoke into a frenzy. The extraction was a blur of adrenaline. The SAS men scrambled from their craters, dragging their packs and weapons, moving with the frantic energy of men who had cheated death. They dove onto the floor of the hovering slicks or hooked into the winches. As the skids lifted and the choppers banked sharply away, the door gunners opened up with their M60s, spraying the tree line to keep the enemy heads down. Looking back from the open door of the Huey, the patrol could see the scar they had left on the earth, a perfect circle of devastation carved into the green ocean of the jungle. They were leaving the kill zone, leaving the NVA, and leaving the coordinates that had almost been their grave. Back at the task force base at Nui Dat, the adrenaline eventually faded, replaced by the crushing exhaustion that follows survival. In the safety of the SAS lines, the patrol would clean their weapons, scrub the cordite from their skin, and debrief the intelligence officer. But before the night was over, there was usually one unofficial protocol that had to be observed. The patrol leader or the signaller would make their way over to the New Zealand lines, often carrying a crate of beer, to find the gun crews of 161 Battery. There were rarely speeches. There was no need for dramatic thank yous. A nod, a handshake, and a cold drink were enough. The gunners, stripped to their singlets and covered in grease, would look at the SAS troopers' men who had literally walked through fire and see the reality of their work. The SAS men would look at the gunners and see the hands that had held their lives in the balance. This ritual highlighted a profound truth about the Australian war in Vietnam. The concept of danger close was not merely a tactical maneuver or a ballistics equation. It was the ultimate expression of the ANZAC bond. In the terrifying isolation of the jungle, when 5 men were surrounded by 100, the only thing that bridged the gap between life and death was trust. It was a blind, absolute trust. The SAS operator had to trust that the Kiwi gunner was disciplined enough to dial in the coordinates perfectly while under immense pressure. The gunner had to trust that the SAS operator was skilled enough to call the fall of shot without panicking. If either side faltered, the result was a blue-on-blue friendly fire catastrophe. History records that the 161 Battery Royal New Zealand Artillery never let the SAS down. They earned a reputation for surgical precision that bordered on the supernatural. For the Australian SAS, the Kiwis were not just allies, they were guardian angels who spoke with a flat accent and brought the thunder when all hope was lost. To this day, the story of Danger Close remains one of the most chilling and heroic chapters of the regiment's history. It serves as a reminder of the extreme lengths to which these soldiers went to survive. It strips away the Hollywood myth of the invincible commando and reveals the human reality, that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is not to charge a machine gun nest, but to lie face down in the mud, hold his ground, and whisper a command that brings the sky crashing down on top of him. The legacy of those fire missions echoes in the silence of the old battlefields of Whauktui. It is a testament to the phantoms who dared to call down the lightning and the brothers who guided it home with steady hands. In the end, they proved that even when surrounded and outgunned, an SAS patrol was never truly alone, not as long as the radio worked and the Kiwis were on the gun line.